Good morning and welcome to this month's Emergency Media and Public Affairs webinar. I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of country throughout Australia and their connections to land, sea, and community. We pay our respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander peoples today. I'm joining you today from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation. My name is Kate Delmo. I'm an academic from the School of Communication at the University of Technology, Sydney. As a member of the EMPA board, it is my pleasure to facilitate today's webinar. On behalf of EMPA, I welcome you all. Today's webinar is entitled, Which EMPA Principle? Approaches to Working with Communities in Recovery. We are joined today by three esteemed panelists. Mark Trüdinger is the Group Recovery Manager for Northland Civil Defense Emergency Management. His approach to community engagement in the recovery initiatives from 2023 Cyclone Gabrielle blends traditional approaches from communication and community engagement with collective community practices. Welcome to the panel, Mark. Christian Longobardi is a Senior Project Officer with the South Australian Government Security, Emergency and Recovery Management Team. Christian has previously worked as a journalist and photographer in South Australia's Riverland for the Maori Pioneer newspaper before returning to Adelaide to work in the Department of Premier Cabinet's Media Monitoring Unit. During the River Murray flood, one of South Australia's most devastating natural disasters in history, Christian joined CERM as a communications officer to help coordinate multi-sectoral recovery communications. Welcome to you as well, Christian. Mike Wassing is committed to supporting communities and strengthening Queensland's disaster management and resilience capabilities. Whilst Mike is normally Deputy Commissioner in Queensland Fire and Emergency Services and Chief Officer of RFS Queensland and SES Queensland, he is currently working with the Queensland Reconstruction Authority responsible for the recovery coordination for 13 councils impacted by Tropical Cyclone Jasper in Queensland's far north. Mike has led the QFS Volunteerism Strategy and 2030 Future Strategy and champions many initiatives in the workplace to positively change organizational culture. Hello to you, Mike. So welcome to you all again, Mark, Christian, and Mike.
Thanks, Kate, for having us here.
Thank you. Okay, so EMPA has 7 principles in emergency and disaster communication. Based on your experience, I'd like us to discuss how the principles apply to emergency and disaster recovery efforts. I'll start with you, Mark. If you can choose 1 or 2 principles that proved to be critical in the recovery efforts that you helped manage during last year's Cyclone Gabrielle or in other hazard contexts, what would they be and why?
Thanks, Kate. The one that really jumps out to me is Principle 3 on community-focused communication. So in New Zealand, there's a director's guideline, which suggests how we should go about recovery. And the first 2 things it says is that we need to do community consultation about the recovery and that we need to produce a recovery plan. But in doing both of those, we need to remember that community are at the heart of the work. So the key guiding question that we took into this recovery from Cyclone Gabrielle last year was, if communities are meant to be at the heart of the work, how do we keep them at the heart of the work? The first thing we did in line with that was to do consultation about the consultation. So if anyone's filled in any kind of a survey or, I don't know, a feedback form, post a conference or whatever it is, you've all had that experience of filling in the form and thinking, these are the wrong questions. This is not what these people need to hear, or this is not what I want to get across. So the key question for us was, how soon do you want to see a recovery plan? And the feedback from communities was 2 months. You've got 2 months to do it. Cyclone at the end of February, we want to see a full plan with exactly what government's going to do end of April. It was a pretty punishing deadline. But if we were going to be accountable to what we'd asked, then we had to meet that deadline. And we did it. So we did what we initially talked about as rapid community consultation. Not a term I like, but we kind of needed to get it across the line with local councils who aren't really used to doing consultation quickly. They're used to longer term things for long-term planning, and consultation takes some months. We don't have that time in recovery. And so we heard from over 300 people in community and then worked with a couple of hundred other key stakeholders. So in the end, we worked with more than 500 people in producing that recovery plan all the content, and then, you know, produced and out in public within that two-month window.
Mhm.
A key part of that, just thinking more about that principle, is I looked at a lot of recovery plans that had gone before, and it wasn't always clear if they had done community consultation, and certainly community voice wasn't a feature of them. So one of the things that we did here was to include community voice quite strongly in the plan. Yes, we have to have a list of what the different, you know, government agencies will be doing, but we actually started every section pretty much of our recovery plan with community voice. They were the first words that people would read, you know, rather than reading my voice, that'd be boring. And so it was woven throughout the whole plan, but the majority of the first third of the community plan overall had community voice in it. Rather than having a singular vision for the recovery, you know, I could have written that, but again, how boring would that be? We had 2 pages of community visions. They were divergent, diverse, varied, but it just showed the complexity of the event and the kinds of things that people wanted to see happen.
Mhm. Oh, thanks for that, Mark. Christian, your work highly involves, among others, Principle 4, which is about creating connection and integrating multi-sectoral efforts in communication during overlapping stages of recovery and response. Can you tell us more about the highs and lows of this?
Yeah, thanks, Kate. Thanks, everyone, for having me. Yeah, I mean, this really speaks to the heart of what we do. So you mentioned CERN before, so that's called Security, Emergency and Recovery Management, and it's located within the Department of Premier and Cabinet. And our role essentially is to coordinate recovery across not only the state government, local government, but also non-government organisations. So really creating those new connections, but also enhancing those existing connections is really how we do recovery in South Australia. I mean, we're not the largest jurisdiction. We don't have the most amount of resources, obviously. So we work closely and rely heavily with those connections, and we really just can't do it without it. So one of the things I did in my role as communications officer was to chair the Public Information and Coordination Group across government. So essentially that brings in all the different state government communication representatives, for lack of a better term, to kind of coordinate consistent messaging across an extended period of time, which allowed us to gauge the pain points in the community as well. One of the key representatives on that meeting were the people that run the State Relief and Recovery Info Line. So they're the ones who are receiving calls daily from the community. So, you know, they might say, oh, communities are asking questions on grants or what's going on with levy management. And we would be able to tailor communications to what the community actually needed. And it can also be quite jarring, I think, to transition communications from the response phase to the recovery phase. And obviously in the River Mo flood, it spanned over 600 kilometres of flood water. So some areas are still in the response phase, while other higher areas are still in that recovery phase. So it was very interesting to kind of coordinate our communications to temper expectations for some people to say, oh, well, you're still in your response phase, but we recognise also that there's a bit of recovery going on as well. Just going back to your questions about connections and communication, just the other day I visited a Blaze Aid camp in Murray Bridge, which is one of those low-lying areas, and I was talking to one of the volunteers, and I said, oh, do you think the community are aware of the support that you're providing to these farmers? In this case, they had to refence because their cattle and whatnot had been displaced. And the individual said, yes, I think the community are aware, but, you know, from government communications, but they kind of, farmers are quite stoic and they don't want to ask for help. They're not used to asking for help. So what they would do is they would wait and see what was going on in the community, see the quality of work, see the community interaction and the connections with those NGOs before reaching out for support. So it was a kind of cases, yes, they know of a support's available and we've kind of done our job as communication, but they don't necessarily take that next step until they see those connections on the ground really making a positive difference. Sorry, I rambled on there. Does that kind of answer your question?
No, that's all good, because my next question is around volunteerism. And thanks for that, Christian. So Mike, your extensive work that you have done in mobilizing volunteerism management in emergency and disaster response and recovery, what are your thoughts on this? Which do you think is the EMPA principle that is key to the kind of work that you're doing?
Thank you, Kate, and good morning, everybody. Could I also just acknowledge the traditional custodians, the lands of which we all meet in our respective locations. And for me, that's the Turrbal and Yuggera people on the Brisbane River. So pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging, and their custodianship of country and community over generations. It's really interesting, and I think all the principles are relevant in different contexts. Certainly from my experience, and I say this both from a response organisation, but even most recently in my state deputy recovery role in TC Jasper, you might think it's about community focused, but it's actually about creating the connection and the integration of efforts. What I've found for a long time now is that communities will very quickly self-organise. They're very adept at using social media and coming together and self-organising themselves. The challenge in that, though, and particularly now with the breadth of the sector that is, it's actually a very wide sector. So whether you're in response, early relief stages, or the recovery phase, there's all levels of government. There's non-for-profit, there's charitable organisations, there's private organisations. So it's quite a complex beast in terms of trying to orientate and coordinate all the different players that have a common purpose in breadth, but don't always necessarily know where they fit in. And certainly my experience for communities is, and our principles in Queensland are fundamentally framed around locally led. And that's a really important construct, is because you can't run this stuff from the state level. It has to be locally led. But it's also how do we actually help that? So there's aspects of integrating their efforts. Most recently, I saw that in TC Jasper, where we had lots of different spontaneous groups that popped up in the relief phases to help with cleanup, as they do, often known as the Mud Army in different forms, but they went beyond that as well. Self-organised groups in different neighbourhoods, but their biggest challenge was they know their local neighbourhood, but they don't know the system. And so I found myself, as well as through local councils, having a lot of conversation around this is where you fit in, this is who you need to talk to make sure the appropriate mechanisms. It started out as a conversation around a bit of level of frustration, but then their self-realisation was actually they're in the best fit to know the people down the road, they know their neighbours, they know their community. For them, it was very much about where do I go for certain help, for certain support mechanisms. And we're still applying that now. It's a core principle, even in the longer term recovery.
Right. So recovery is a journey and people are often at different stages at any given time. So my question is, how do we tailor our messaging to reflect this variance across communities, particularly those emergencies and disasters that affect a large area? Christian, would you like to have a go first?
Sure, yeah. I mean, this kind of feeds into what I was saying earlier, going back to that event, spanning 600 kilometres, and people aren't all in recovery at the same time. And even if they are in recovery at the same time, they're at different stages of their recovery. So how do we, first of all, understand who are those people and how do we message them? I think they're two of the really key challenges for recovery communication practitioners. So one of the main things we did, obviously, as part of any recovery, is did a whole bunch of community meetings led by the community recovery coordinator, whose name is Alex Zimmerman. So he's appointed by the state government, and he's effectively the conduit between the state support and that local level. So we went up and down the river, and you could tell in those meetings that the questions coming from the community were wildly different. The people in those lower lying areas, they're not necessarily interested, well, they are interested in something like a grant, but their pressing concerns are more like what's going on with the levy situation. How do we ensure that floods don't happen in the future, and my property's being more affected and whatnot. So that really kind of gave us a gauge or a temperature check of what everyone's needs are, and then we were able to coordinate those communications across not only the state government, but also in those community meetings, we could tap into the local networks that were available on the ground. I mean, it's all well and good for us to, start up a community newsletter from the state level, but our mailing list will be quite small compared to the local TV or radio or newspapers. they're not only they have more outreach to people in the community, but they're obviously seen as more credible because they're there for the good times and the bad. We might just be coming in as recovery begins, and it takes us time to build that credibility. Whereas we need to really access the on-the-ground networks. I think that's just so important.
All right, Mark, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I've got a couple. So one is not to traffic in generalizations. I think there's a risk in recovery to say this is how it is for all people, and to acknowledge that recovery is really different. And it's not just geographic, like Christian was talking about, which is really important, but also that people's experience of recovery varies. So you can have two people in the same household who have a completely different experience of the same event. You can have one person experience the same event this year, but experience a similar event next year, and their experience across those two events is completely different. So I think not making assumptions and not trafficking in generalizations is really important. The second one would be, with that diversity experience, how do we open space for those experiences to come forth? And then my third would be, how do we then reflect that diversity back to those communities so that the diversity of those experiences, of those perspectives, and of what they're hoping to have happen next, because ultimately that's what recovery is all about. How do we reflect that back into communities so that people can talk through us, not just to us? The final one is, one thing we've done is not to traffic in the idea of people having recovered. We didn't ask people, how have you recovered? Which suggests that there's an endpoint, and there may not be for some folks, and that we don't want to sort of force that or have some normalizing judgment on where people should be up to. So we're often talking in the kind of present tense about what's helping you get through this recovery. It's just a couple of quick thoughts.
Oh, very important. I'm thinking the emotional journey of community members, victims, and the families perhaps are central in terms of trying to think about what kind of messaging are we going to deliver at which stage of the recovery or even the response. Mike, your thoughts on this, please?
Yeah, very, very similar, I got to say. So hammered into me from a long time experience is really about timely, tailored and relevant messaging. And you've heard that from Christian and Mark as well. And that applies throughout the event. It's the same in the response construct, the warnings, but so essential in terms of the relief and the recovery operations, including the longer term, as both Mark and Christian have indicated. I think it is, there are aspects of that are spatial because the event is typically a spatial kind of construct. But as we've heard again, it's not just about that. It's actually understanding the demographic. It's understanding the different vulnerabilities of communities and the different consequences. And often the consequences are secondary through isolation, or whether that be communications or road network breakages, whatever that might be. And so being able to adapt the messaging that's relevant to those is really, really important, and the timeliness of that. So as things change, it's a well-researched pathway in terms of recovery. What the highs and lows of what communities will go through is probably a preferred pathway there in some respects. And how do you shorten, bridge that? Communications, again, plays a key part of that. And again, I think, as Mark's indicated there too, really important message about communications is listening and hearing. We often go to forums and community meetings face-to-face can be quite contentious at any given time and difficult. But one of the key things that we're trying to build in terms of capability for our people that are in those and our partners is to the ability to listen and then also hear that. And distill what can be quite a complex mixture of emotional conversation at different times, from adrenaline through to fear, through to despair, and how do you cut through that to actually understand and hear what the key messages are and tailor your messaging and communications to that.
Thanks for that, Mike. You mentioned the importance of capability and capacity to actually try to look at that journey so that you are able to tailor the kind of messaging that perhaps the victims or community members at large would want to hear at a certain stage. What fields or what ideas or fields or practices are you drawing on in your recovery work that are outside the usual approaches to communication, if there's any? Christian?
Yeah, that's an interesting one. This is actually well, luckily for me, I suppose, it's actually my first event. So the term usual for me, I think, is still pretty new in terms of how we go about communicating disaster recovery. But thinking about this, I think one of the things that we do well, at least in South Australia, and I'm sure the other panelists can speak to it, is really targeting communities that see themselves as forgotten because of their size. So there are some communities, going back to the River Murray flood event, that are incredibly small, but they're still informed about. We're talking about like shack communities. There might only be like 3 or 4 shacks in this little community, and they can easily feel like they're forgotten, and I completely understand why. So through the community recovery coordinator and community development officer that we appoint, we really make a focus on, especially in the long tail of recovery, just going back there, just checking in. I think that's something that we kind of do quite well, because it's, like I say, it's very easy to overlook those people. Well, we've had, I think, about over 3,000 people affected, properties affected. So in the grand scheme of things, it's not very significant. But the way I see it is our recovery is only as good as the people that are affected. But you know, if they're forgotten, then our recovery isn't effective, even if most people are, because we're trying to capture everyone, and we're trying to have these communities to be resilient, regardless of their scale, and regardless of their scope and their scale and what they bring to wider communities as well. And so there's other things that we do. We do a lot of community development efforts. For example, one of the groups that we do is women of the Lower Murray Reclaimed Irrigation Area. So that's that low-lying area. Again, just doing a lot of community development. It might be lunches, it might be paint workshops, bringing people together and, you know, just kind of getting their mind off of the disaster and the recovery, and just kind of re-establishing those networks that might have been impacted by, you know, displacement or whatnot. On top of that, we do pop-up recovery centres. We have the established recovery centres, but we also do pop-up recovery centres to areas that are out of the way. People can't reach the established recovery centres. So just a whole lot of outreach as well that we do, I think, is just so important to inform that communication.
Mm-hmm. So community development initiatives, community outreach initiatives. Mark, do you have some more to add to the list that Christian has kindly provided already?
So there's 2 main practices that I draw on in my work. The first is called collective narrative practice, and the second one is memory practices. So collective narrative practice is an approach to community work that was developed in Australia, actually, and looks at how do we work with communities that have experienced tough times. So I've been fortunate to work on and off for about 30 years for the organisation that developed these approaches. They trained the Peak Genocide Survivors Organisation in Rwanda, the Peak Torture and Trauma Survivors Centre in Palestine, and related colleagues in Israel. So working in communities that experienced extremely tough times as a result of war, torture and trauma, and large disasters. One of the ideas that comes out of that is that we can capture people's experiences and record them. There's a phrase from anthropology about rescuing the said from the saying of it and rescuing the done from the doing of it. So similar to what I think Mike and Christian have touched on, not only in response, but also in recovery, emergency management is both top down and bottom up. People are always doing so much, and we probably don't know most of what goes on. So how do we capture those stories and how do we recognise them? This touches on another principle in collective narrative practice called double-storied accounts. So the risk is that we go into communities and ask them what the impacts were. And we know a lot about impact language and needs assessment and so on. But if all we do at the end of that is to perhaps provide something for those folks and then walk away, the challenge is that those folks can experience themselves as purely the recipients of our, generosity or goodwill, as well-intentioned as it is, but they don't necessarily experience themselves as agentive. And, we've talked to people who filled in needs assessments, especially in refugee camps, who say, at the end of these accounts of what did I lose, what were the lacks, who died, how was I affected, I actually feel worse for this process rather than better. So how do we ask questions in a way that doesn't sort of re-traumatize people? But how do we do these sort of double-storied accounts so that acknowledging that people always respond? People always take action, even if that's small, even if it's just making sense out of what's happened to them in their head. There's always little steps that people take. So how do we elicit those kinds of stories as well, not just the stories of accounts of impact and so on? Another one is, or a principle within collective narrative practice, is embodied speech acts. So when we did our community consultation, we didn't just ask, how has this impacted you, or what steps have you taken? We always said you and your community. Sounds like a simple linguistic shift, but what it allowed people to do was think of themselves in relation to others. So start reflecting, yes, on their own experience, but how that related to the others near them, whether it was in their household, their neighbours, their community, and so on. And what we then heard back was people locating what happened to them and also what they're hoping to see next in terms of who they were in the world. So people would say, as a mother, I, or as a business owner, I, as a farmer, I. So that we could, by asking the questions, start that work of connecting people within their own communities. And we had people, again, as simple as it sounds, say, the very fact of thinking about others in my community then prompted me to go back out and check on others, or to thank those people who helped us out during the event, just by us having asked the question. The final one is an idea called enabling contribution. So apart from the questions that we asked around what were the effects or impacts, how did you respond, and then what would you like to see happen next? We also said, Northland comparatively for Cyclone Gabrielle wasn't as affected as a few other regions of New Zealand. If you had messages of support for them at this time, what might they be? And we could capture those answers to the question and then share it with the other affected regions, so that people's experience of an event up here would actually be not for naught, that they could capture what it is that they'd been through, but also offer a message of support, encouragement, and so on to other regions. And we could share that physically as a document. So we collect all this into a document we call a collective document. And that then falls into that second area drawn, which is around memory practices. So we can have an event come through, and then afterwards people are a little bit all at sea because, well, what just happened? This cyclone's bustled through the region. Where are we now? Yes, there's a few physical things to fix up, but experientially, what just happened to people? A lot of what we traffic in, I think, in recovery is the invisible. During response, we're often dealing with what's obviously visible, the issues with the roads or the, food that needs to get to communities or whatever it is. And a lot of that then remains. But when we get into recovery, we're having to find out what's invisible. What were people's experiences? Where were the affected communities that we didn't know about, and so on? When we know what people's experience is, how do we then acknowledge that? And how do we keep a hold of that so it doesn't just disappear? Again, rescuing the said from the saying of it. So how do we create, for example, documents that capture people's experience that can exist and people hold on to them? And some of the kinds of work that we've done around this, people still hold on to that document 30 years later. Whatever it is that relates to them or was significant in their life. They might have moved house multiple times. They might not own anything else that's the exact same thing, but they come and they hold on to these little documents saying, this is the thing where my words are, or my parents' words, or this is what reflects what we went through. This reflects our experience. So I'm really interested in practices of memory.
Very interesting, because at the heart of all of those, let's say, frameworks of understanding are lived experiences of community members. And I think that's when we become strategic in our communication initiatives, when we understand the various lived experiences of those people we're communicating with. Mike, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I really listening with intrigue in terms of what Mark and Christian have just described there. I concur with all that's been said, so I won't sort of go down the same path. But I think if there's one component that's a key focus for my approach, my leadership, and something that I've tried to instill in any organisation I've worked for in the disaster management aspect, is about working with community. And there's a range of different practices, but often as agencies, as government organisations, we often talk about delivery of service to a community. And fundamentally in the disaster management, that's not the approach, whether it's before, during, or after a disaster. I think in this context, and maybe if I can tackle it from a different perspective, is one of the things that I think collectively, and there's good practice out there, but I think we need to get better at this and learn from each other nationally and internationally, is actually understanding community capability and even what does that mean. And when we say community, there's many different variations of what that might be. But actually understanding the different aspects of community capability before events, and therefore able to again, be better, our approaches will be better informed in terms of whether it be during an event or certainly after an event. I can speak from experience that, like most post-disasters, there's a heavy emphasis in inquiries, royal commissions in the response focus. And that tends to draw out learnings and improvements in what went well that are agency specific. The true learnings are actually in recovery. And if you actually have more understanding of outcomes and improvements and what went well in recovery, will be better informed at the front end in terms of risk reduction, community capability, and the like. And I think there's a missed opportunity there because there's always this heavy focus in terms of reviews. I know in my previous role, I got 2,500 different recommendations over the last 4 years that I'm dealing with. How many of those are relevant? They're past events. I think there's a real opportunity with what Mark and Christian are describing, and others are actually practicing in pockets of little pockets of excellence, if you will, that I have the privilege of seeing on occasion, to actually systemise that in terms of disaster management that has recovery, communications, understanding the community, drive the before aspects of learnings and readiness and preparedness.
I mean, I think the focus on the life cycle, right, of prevention, preparedness, response, and recovery, I think it's quite central because at some point we know that they're overlapping, but they make distinct contributions in terms of how you can actually build resilient communities there. So quite agree with the points that have been raised so far. I'll now move to the Q&A window that we have here. We have one question from Michael Stewart. And the question is, do you have any tips or best practice resources about how to use generative AI to rapidly produce recovery and or response communication plans? I'll probably give this first to Christian.
That's an interesting question. I can't say as I've used ChatGPT for my communications. I think I probably have to defer to my panelists. I mean, it's tricky because, you know, AI can be useful to kind of generate thought ideas, but I think capturing the community sentiment and understanding the needs and impacts, I don't think AI is there yet. But it's really not my area of expertise. I'm sorry.
I mean, it's true. It's a tricky question. Let's see. Mark, what do you think?
I've never used it either, and maybe I'm just an old fuddy-duddy, but I hope I never do. I mean, I see it obviously as an incredibly powerful tool, and I see some contexts in which it can be really useful. We heard from one of our colleagues last year who spent a lot of time developing a manual for volunteers on the fly as part of the cyclone. When someone else came along and plugged the question into an AI program and it spat out almost the exact same stuff. Like the capability is incredible. My concerns is that there's hazards, and if we then get something that's kind of provided for us, what limitations might it provide on our own thinking and creativity? I'd rather have a blank sheet and approach it from there.
Right, especially if community consultation is quite central as a driving factor that actually drives your communication. Having a template being generated by technology perhaps will not necessarily fit that.
Well, and also my take on comms in recovery is that it has to be incredibly responsive. So, there's a template for recovery comms in New Zealand. We didn't use it. We sat down and I sat down with our comms manager and we looked at it, and yes, we could have stepped out. We're going to do, this story this month and this theme that month or whatever. We took almost the opposite approach and said, let's not have a plan. Let's just monitor what's going on and then do what we need to as we go. Next time around, we'll probably do more of a blended approach. But I just think you can't structure in advance exactly what a plan is going to be in recovery because everything is different one week to the next.
Mm-hmm. All right. Thanks, Mark. Mike, your views on this?
Yeah, look, it's a great question. I'm a fan of AI, but I can't say I understand it. I think there is absolutely a place, and we're testing some of this in different ways, not so much from a communications perspective, but certainly early days in using AI in terms of information sharing. My problem is never about data in any part of my business. There's so much data available. My problem is actually interpreting that data and information into informed intelligence that helps with decision making. AI has absolutely got a place to that, and we're testing some of those sort of areas in different ways. There's absolutely a role for AI in that context for the recovery component in rapidly informing different decision making in the recovery operations as well. From a communications perspective, look, I think we'll end up there at some point. But like a lot of communications, there's not one size that fits all. So I think AI will have a place, it'll grow, it'll develop what that actually looks like, but it's really hard to take the human out of humanitarian effort, I suppose, is what I'd say. Yeah.
Right. Thank you. Mark, this is a question from you, from Riri Hamad, for you specifically. Being Northland based, you know how hard it is to get good engagement from pockets of your rural communities. You mentioned, following Gabriel, receiving around 300 responses from the community, which to me indicates the same challenges to get feedback from rural Maori communities. How did the TLAs ensure they were getting feedback from those hard to reach and engage groups?
Wow, there's a lot in there to unpack, isn't there? You know, 300 as a number to some folks may not seem large. I've got to say, if you're staying up at night till midnight each night for weeks on end, reading every single one of them, it's quite big, especially if you're then trying to synthesize them into a document and put it into a plan. But for us, people often said where they were from. And there are a lot of people from remote communities across Taitokerau, Northland. There are a lot of people who were from remote Māori communities across Northland who participated in that process. Having said that, I'm painfully aware that's really limited to do an online survey. I usually don't fill in online surveys in life. That's not my preferred way of working. And, you know, this is an approach to community work that I've bring. So my screen's gone dark. Is much more usually face-to-face. Of course, we're a bit pressured for time, and we had hoped to do some more. We did a lot of one-to-one face-to-face, but I would have liked to have done more face-to-face meetings. We'd lined some up, some of those fell through the cracks. And I'd like to do more of that in the future for sure. The flip side of that, I think, is that there's sometimes a will in recovery to hold community meetings. There's a culturally relevant context for that in terms of Tawa Māori in New Zealand, like kanahi ki te kanahi, face-to-face, absolutely important. But more broadly, there's been some really good critiques of the idea of public meetings and public hall meetings. And you see quite a lot of photos of those, and I don't know if this is the case everywhere, but often it only gets to a really specific demographic. Like if it's during the day, it's folks who aren't necessarily, you know, depending on where they are and if they can take time off work, but they're not necessarily working. So it might be more retired folks. If it's at night time, the photos I've seen, it's often kind of older folks, you know, folks with kids are at home. So Raven Cretney has written a fantastic piece that kind of critiques this idea of the will to public meeting. And that it's not to say don't do it, but that, you know, we need to have that not be the only solution. But in terms of the consultation we got here, yeah, there was quite a lot of participation by remote Māori communities.
Thank you. A question here. Christian, would you like to comment on that?
No, I just want.
Oh, I think I lost Christian. Okay, I'll get back to you, Christian, when you're back here with us. Another question from Juliet Gibbons. Any thoughts on managing a community's expectations around what they would like or expect to be delivered in the recovery versus what may be able to be afforded? Mike?
Yeah, great question again, very relevant. I think for mine to begin with, it's probably less about what can be afforded in the context of monetary value, probably what can be afforded in the context of, and I'll be blunt here, creating a nanny state. So governments can lean in at any level, charities, all the different contributing agencies can lean in a range of different ways. But unless that is actually, again, with and tailored and considered it can actually have adverse outcomes longer term. What I'm certainly seeing is there's a gap between impact and consequence for communities, whether that be small business, tourism, primary producers, any aspect that we're talking about, any functional alignment, to insurance. Insurance plays a big part in here in terms of, and we consider insurance one of the vulnerabilities, whether people are insured, not insured, the cost of insurance, those sorts of things. And that's a whole conversation and probably a whole seminar in its own right. But there is a time lag in the insurance component in terms of assessment, and different companies will be different approaches to that. But what I'm certainly seeing is, because there is a lag, there's not only just a greater expectation on government to lean in and support communities and individuals, but there's a greater speed expectation that we fill the void. And what is core still to I think part of resilience, and it's not just about insurance, but it's actually about understanding what support occurs. And this is, again, not just a recovery discussion. This is about what response operations, what relief operations, and what recovery operations are done with communities, again, tailored to make sure that we're not lessening the resilience, that we're actually helping build the resilience. And sometimes that is a bit of tough love. Sometimes that is actually know that that's not what's going to occur, or you can create options and different pathways, but we've got to be really conscious that we don't lean in too far. And ultimately, if we do, what we end up with is a real imbalance in terms of more and more money going into recovery operations and not into risk reduction. And again, that's a conversation in its own right.
Yep. Right. Thank you, Mike. Mark, your thoughts on this?
Yeah. I think one of the key things is not to ask people, what do you want? There's a lot of things that people want, wants are limitless. So when we asked people what they wanted to see happen next, we purposefully said, what are your hopes and dreams for this recovery? And what does recovery look like to you? They were really consciously chosen words. Now, initially, someone said to me, hopes and dreams, that sounds kind of woolly, doesn't it? I said, well, I don't know. I read business and government documents say they've got a vision. That sounds woolly. But when we asked people hopes and dreams, it meant we could choose the quite lofty ideas, and that formed our community visions for our recovery plan, but also gave us a whole suite of possible practical project ideas. And we've taken some of them up in this recovery. But we never said, what do you want? Because that then creates an expectation that we'll deliver on that want. And we can't do that for every possible project idea. I think that's a key one. The other is just about recovery does cost money. Like, it's not all about money, obviously. And a lot of the best recovery work is that invisible work that happens out there in communities that we never hear of. That's probably the stuff that means the most to people in general, and potentially is the longest lasting. But at the end of the day, if stuff breaks, then fixing it is going to cost money. The challenge there is that that's not guaranteed at the beginning. That's certainly been our experience. So the entire funding process for the recovery formally here sort of fell over, and we're not really sure, where it's up to now. That's a trick. If we go out there early on communicating to communities that we will achieve X, Y, Z, if that's not completely secured, that's a real risk. So being really careful about what kind of communications we're putting out there in terms of financial support is really important.
I think the importance of setting priorities based on resources is quite central as well, in terms of setting expectations and the pace of the recovery efforts just the same. So thanks for that. Another question from Marcus Overman. You spoke about tapping into community channels during recovery as they are more credible and connected to community. What are some good ways to do this without changing the community voice or sentiments within these channels throughout the response and recovery phases? Christian, welcome back. I don't know what happened to your slight glitch there, but would you like to have a go at this question first?
Yeah, sorry about that. Just kind of cut out there. I think the main thing is really just communicating directly with those media people on the ground, and just explore, because a lot of people don't really understand the nuances of recovery. I think if you're not in it day to day, I think you expect better outcomes at a quicker pace. And I think it's just kind of setting expectations with media personnel or those local networks, those community leaders or whatnot, about this is going to be a long process. We are with you throughout the entire journey, and just kind of providing some key messaging. And then they don't necessarily have to take that key messaging and just proliferate it word for word. They can tailor it to their local communities. They can actually come back and say, look, what you're telling us, this is the support that might be available, but this won't work for this community or a subsection of this community. So it's really just working with them and then trying to ascertain, okay, what will work within multiple communities, and they can really tailor those responses. I think that's probably a great tip in that space.
Right. I think we've mentioned or we've tapped into tailored messages here, but Mike, would you like to add a few more points?
Yeah, I think one of the things we try and do is, run community sentiment assessment. So we actually have, and again, you can run this through any part of the disaster management scheme to actually draw out, and largely that's focused on social media, but it's an input. What that helps then for us is to actually, one, tailor the messaging, but also understand some of the noise. And again, you've got to be cautious around noise versus actual. But it's a key input to some of our messaging and communication approaches. I think you can't, you've got to have multiple different methods though, ultimately in my experience. So you've the online community sentiment component. You can't beat a good community meeting. Again, and for me, it's not just the noisy people or the leadership group that you got to listen to. You got to kind of pick up on the voices that aren't there, that are sitting in the back of the room, that will come and talk to you afterwards. And so again, there's a human factor in that in terms of the communication approaches and styles that you can't mix. But I think we've got to, and it kind of links up a bit with the earlier AI question. I think more and more as different opportunities, different methods are available in terms of communicating both ways again, that we should lever off those wherever we can, and there's not one size fits all. There's a multitude of these, and it's then how do you actually package that and appropriately deal with those sorts of things.
All right. This is probably a follow-up to the points you have made a while ago, Mark. Rather than ask people about what they want, do you ask people what they need for recovery? And this question is from Mary Ann Young.
I can understand where that question might be coming from, but I would say no, because what one person's want is another one's need, and vice versa. I think trafficking in wants and needs can be quite challenging, and I think we also need to think through what are the unintended consequences. And Mike alluded to this earlier of the work that we do. There's a lot of harm that's been done to communities by governments with the best of intentions. And I think we always need to have that in mind as we do recovery. A lot can happen very quickly, and we can introduce, whether it's new infrastructure or new social programs or whatever it is, that may not really have the outcomes we're really hoping for. And so, a lot has been done, a lot of harm has been done under the rubric of, under the rhetoric of need, I think, over the years. And we just need to be mindful of the history of that. There's a fantastic book that we draw on for inspiration in that regard and guides a lot of what we do, what I do, called Seeing Like a State. I think the subtitle is something like How Large Government Projects Often Fail, something like that. So I think we just need to be careful of those kind of unintended consequences, especially like Mike was talking about around creating further dependencies. Yes, there might be certain responsibilities that governments have about restoring roads, but if we start getting down into, organising communities' own social events that they otherwise would have done themselves, what are we taking away from the local skills, the local knowledge, the local practices about doing that?
I'll probably get the title of the book from you later, Mark, offline, because that probably is an interesting resource to look into. Another question from Susan Henry. Do you have any specific guidance when working with urban communities in recovery? Christian?
Sorry, can you just say what type of communities we're talking about?
Right. So do you have any specific guidance when working with urban communities in recovery?
Oh, not necessarily. I think they have tyranny of distance issues to work through. So I think one of the key things would be providing multiple options for them to get information. We talked about community meetings before. While you try and do as many meetings as you can across a wide area, they just might not be able to reach it. So provide alternatives. They can call the info line. They can contact the community recovery coordinator. They can get in touch with the community development officer. They can visit one of the pop-up recovery centres. Yeah, I mean, tyranny of distance, that's part of urban life, but that's really no excuse for a communication practitioner to say, well, we can't reach you. You're just going to have to go on a website and work it out. We really need to do that extra outreach. That's certainly one of the things I'd say on that.
Yep. Mike, your thoughts on this?
Yeah, sorry, Kate. Was it about urban communities or
Yes, urban communities.
urban communities? Yeah. So I think for mine, it's the thing I've noticed in urban communities is the network. So more rural communities, they got a stronger pre-established relationship and connection typically for a whole range of different reasons, for a whole range, particularly in services. So we often describe them as more resilient. That's in a certain lens, but that's not always the case, depending on what lens you take. But they're certainly better connected, would be my experience. Urban environments can be really different. It's not that they're not connected; they're just connected in a really different way. And actually understanding, this goes to my earlier point about understanding communities in different lenses and understanding their networks and how they are connected. And my experience in urban communities is understanding the diversity and how to utilise those diversity of groups, representative groups, whether it be cultural, in whatever fashion. Sometimes it's charitable organisations, church groups, cultural groups, whatever it might be, are really important, particularly if you're going to target the most vulnerable. And again, for me, I keep coming back to, for me, it's less about hazard, it's more about the vulnerability and exposure of community, and that can be vulnerability and exposure of systems and infrastructure as well. But in this case, focusing on people, it's actually understanding those kind of constructs. The other aspect with urban is the volume. So you can have quite a small event that has an enormous impact in terms of quantity of people and infrastructure. And that can be quite complex in its own right. So you've actually got to adapt. The same principles to apply in the whole recovery operations, but the communications will be a different network.
Right. Okay, I'm mindful of our time. We probably have room for 2 more questions, and then we will slowly wrap up. So the next question is from Georgina. How do you use the momentum during recovery to push towards readiness and reduction? In terms of legislative changes, such as a bad town planning, is this part of your recovery plans as well to involve other players in the whole risk reduction cycle? I think we have quite discussed this, but yes, your thoughts on this? I'll throw it first to Mark.
Yeah, I love this question. We're really fortunate in New Zealand that the very definition of recovery in the Act says that we need to plan for future resilience and risk reduction. It's not just a wish or a maybe, it's part of the legislated definition of recovery. And that for me has been incredibly useful in talking with, a lot of different people, whether that's communities, whether that's elected members, and especially actually, with the National Recovery Office that was set up for here. Initially, they didn't want to fund anything that was sort of future looking and said that anything about resilience was off the table. And we're able to use the legislation to be able to say, well, actually, sorry, no, if we don't do that, then we're not, following the law. What we've done practically, there's 2 quick things. One would be in working with the lifeline utilities, so critical infrastructure. Really strong feedback out of the cyclone here. Big impacts for people were roads, power, telecommunications, understandably. And people said, we want to know what is being done by those three, not only to recover from that event, but for future resilience so we don't go through this again. So we had around about 64,000 customers, that's locations, not people, without power across the event, and for some for over 2 weeks. And we were able to take that to the Lifelines forum, so that Lifelines group where they all meet together and say, would you be happy to take this on as a challenge? So not only talk about in the recovery plan the work you're going to do for restoration of service, but what you'll commit to, short, medium, and long term, something concrete, but it will actually be a public commitment. And so in our regional recovery plan, we published that as a list of commitments from the sector, which showed a real joined up approach, and it showed a commitment by all of them to what they take on voluntarily. The second thing was that the biggest project that came out of the recovery here is something it's the single largest thing that we can do to ensure electricity supply in future events. So the big impact electricity network here was trees down on power lines. And the idea for that as a project dealing with those trees that are right next to power lines came from community. And so we're looking to, future resilience, and the trees that are right next to the power lines, we're then cutting them up and providing them to low-income communities for free as firewood. So there's some pretty incredible things that can come out when you take that future focus rather than just the backwards focus, if you will, of just restoration.
Right. Thanks, Mark. And now the last question I'm going to ask Mike. Is there any study or experience on how hazard insurance influences community perceptions and actions during a hazard?
Yeah, there's a range of different studies, and I can try and find some of those offline and share them back through the forum network if you like. A lot of those, and this might sound a bit surprising for some maybe, a lot of those are actually led by Insurance Council. And if you want to find data around hazard and disasters, and studies, Insurance Council, or in our case, Insurance Council Australia, are we consider them a key partner and stakeholder. They help us with a whole lot of our pre-informed planning, our risk identification, our state risk reporting, and so on and so forth, because they have so much data, as you'd expect. Whilst they're running a business, their business is attached to some sort of impact. So I couldn't call them out specifically, but I think the other aspect for mine that is, and it's got to be continuing to be topical, I think, in terms of not just the studies, but I think this ties to the earlier question around community expectations, wants, needs, and in many cases, insurance is becoming unaffordable. And if the government continues to fill that void, then that slide will continue and we'll have more vulnerable people, would be my. And so that's a wicked problem in its own right. Some of those studies identify that. But I think on a more positive aspect, and this leads to the previous question around things like betterment and how do you learn how to recovery into improved aspects before events. Many of those hazard studies can actually pre-identify risks, and one for Queensland that's just been recently released. And again, the insurance companies were part of this process about severe wind, e.g. cyclones, but not just cyclones, because certainly for Queensland, we got lots of severe wind events that are not cyclonic, but have significant impacts in storms and the like. And what that showed is that effectively there's this magic line from Bundaberg north that means you have to have a certain building standard in terms of when you build north of that. South of Bundaberg, you don't need that. But the probability work and the work that we've done in the hazard schema identifies that the probabilities of those sorts of events in the south of Bundaberg, e.g. middle of Queensland and southeast Queensland, are just as probable. So that's now driving a conversation in terms of building regulations, building redesign, funding through grants to subsidise improvements to home. Instead of spending 50K on your kitchen upgrade, maybe you want to spend 30K on tying down your roof. So they're real tangible things that kind of come out of those hazard identifications. Sorry, my last point though is it's not always about the hazard. I think there is more to be done and more studies and more research to be done around the vulnerability and consequences and the capability and the probability a lot of our learnings are looking backwards.
Mhm.
The probabilities in some of the work we're now doing in heatwave is projecting forward based on climatic conditions, or again in the context of natural hazards, but you can project risk. And that's the risk that we need to really plan for, because if we're not doing that, we're going to be behind the 8 ball.
Right. Thank you for that, Mike. I wish we had more time, but at this point, allow me to thank you once again, our esteemed panelists today, Mark, Christian, and Mike. And thank you to everyone in the audience for your insightful questions. As always, the recording will be made available to you via our website in the next few days. And while you are there, please check out all the upcoming EMPA events. So on behalf of EMPA, thank you once again, and see you all for the next webinar in March. Thanks, everybody. Have a very good day.
Thanks, Kate. Thanks all.